Professor Zach up here from the groups downstairs. I hope you've all enjoyed the discussions. What we'd like to do at this point is to invite someone from each of the groups to come up and just speak for about 3 minutes or so and give us a quick overview of what you've discussed and the main principles or conclusions that you may have reached. And after each one, we'll open it up if anybody has a question or two to ask. And we'll go through the 4 of those, and then we'll have a little bit of a conclusion based on all of these discussions. So we'll go ahead and start with the first group, which is the one I was sitting in on with Ezequiel Santagada. So Ezequiel, if you wouldn't mind coming up.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Our group talked about the tools of the enforcement and more effective environmental laws dealing with climate change. We put some ideas here. We talked a lot about reshaping the principle 10 of Rio, dealing with access to information, participation, dealing with information to match the access to information law to the movement of open data, and to use the current technology to make information more effective and more useful for the general public in order to enjoy the human right in order to have access to the human right of, you said, Tara, remember me that human right? The benefits of scientific progress. And, well, to change the rules of participation in international fora to include civil society organizations when we are negotiating international agreements. We don't have that in Principle 10. And we have some examples. For instance, CEPAL right now, they are dealing with the Principle 10 Convention here in America, and they have specific rules to allow the participation of civil society. Well, I think we should know those rules and to work on those rules to make civil society organizations more effective on international fora. Then we talk about greening national laws, particularly private international law, in order to make a conversation between international environmental law and, for instance, international investment agreements, rules of international private law, in order to green the local rules, local and international rules of private law. Also to reach a cohesion between international environmental laws and international law more generally. Those were maybe three ideas that we've been discussing in order to improve the better levels of enforcement and the accomplishment of international obligations. That's it.
Okay, next we'll have the group with Maria Moresi.
Thank you. So our group, we had a very interesting discussion, and I think we went over time and did not discuss the key principles, but we did talk about solutions and some legal mechanisms that we should look at. And the first one here is, so if the members of my group, if I'm not explaining anything correctly, please feel free to explain. The first thing we talked about was, in terms of governance and rights, is litigation, public interest litigation. And this is something that most of the members in the group discussed that was lacking in the countries that they come from, but also in the context of the environmental law associations, given that environmental law associations, some ELAs choose not to include public interest litigation as part of the objectives of the organization, but they would rather work with government in terms of providing legal assistance or legal advice and other services that they are able to provide. And we public interest litigation is not one of them. So it is it could be an alternative approach where public interest organizations are set up to bridge that gap. We also talked about, like, in the sense of environmental law associations, they do refer cases to their members who are able to conduct litigations either on a pro bono basis, or they could charge if the services they provide are quite significant. The examples that we have there was a case, super highway case. Anyways, the other one is promotion of peer groups. And we also talked about liability. I can't recall what, this is liability for, we'll skip it. We talked a lot about integration as a form of solution, because most of the experiences are different departments responsible with different areas, and they are not talking to each other. So there's a need for integration, and there was an example that our colleague Rodrigo mentioned that he faces with regards to the experience that they have here in Brazil, where a certain department would say no and the other one is saying yes to a certain issue. So the need for integration is something that, in terms of governance, is an area that needs to be considered. We talked about compensation, mostly with regards to displacement, or in the sense of people who are living within protected areas. There was also an example given by a colleague in Brazil as well. I think it was Rodrigo again, who mentioned about the slums in some certain areas within Brazil where people are living within the protected areas. And so in order to get them out, you need to have some sort of like compensation for them, or an alternative place where they could live in. So there's a need for that as well. An interesting thing that was raised by another colleague from Brazil, and interestingly, is empowering people through the use of technology. In terms of awareness and education, providing information to the people on the ground, to the communities, the citizens of the country. That example was the Constitution being circulated through mobile phones, and where there was an issue where citizens could not enjoy the carnivals in the streets, but they had a right to under the Constitution. And with that information in their phones, they were able to provide the police with that information saying, I have a right to be here, and you don't have a right to take away that right from me. So the use of technology is one area that we can all look at if it's not happening in your country. Sub-regional coordination as well was mentioned by colleagues from East Africa. There is a need for that, and the example given was on waste on paper bags. Is it paper bags or plastic bags? I think it's plastic bags where in one country it's banned, in the other it's not, but because they go in and out from one country to another in East Africa, if you take a plastic bag from this country to the country that is banned, that bans plastic bags, you know, there's a need for some sort of sub-regional agreement that deals with these issues. I think, well, we've got a whole list of things there, but because of time.
Okay, next we'll hear from Caitlin from your group.
So, like the others, we try to find a number of principles to discuss. The first one we discussed was the principle of sovereignty, as well as non-interference in domestic affairs. In relation to that, we also discussed the principle Rio 7. I saw that the other group also discussed one of the Rio principles of reframing that principle. And then we discussed an application of that to areas beyond national jurisdiction. Secondly, we discussed the obligation to cooperate, or the cooperation principle, which is established in the European Union. We then went further to applying that to a non-institution, to a non-state setting, so to apply that to institutional multilateral collaboration between different institutions involved in environmental law. And then we went one level down and discussed participation of non-state actors, and in particular the role of individuals and individual communities in relation to public participation in decision making. And in that relation, we also talked about the Aarhus Convention and extrapolating the principles of the Aarhus Convention to wider application. Finally, we discussed human security and securitization. I'm not sure whether that's actually a word in English. Lydia, you can perhaps correct me. And we took that down to discuss then public-private partnerships and the role that private law plays, or the role that private law perhaps should play in international environmental law, and how we can enforce environmental law through private mechanisms. So I don't know if anyone of the group would like to say anything more in relation to those principles, but that's all we really had time for. Is there anyone who wants to make a contribution of our group?
Just maybe to add something about a principle that looks to try and resolve conflicts between other principles that apply. Obviously, with developments in technology, it's not always possible for us to foresee all the likely conflicts, and picking up, for example, in the talk earlier about geoengineering, where does the balance of precaution lie in those situations? So the development of a principle that would look to try and reconcile that, perhaps along with ecological integrity.
Anyone else from our group? No? Well, that summarizes our contribution for today.
Now, last but not least, Lydia with her group.
Lydia will speak to our rapporteur.
Okay, so our group had a rather broad topic, which was sustainable development, biodiversity, and other cross-cutting issues. So first, in speaking about the main problems, we identified this tension between development and sustainability. So you have threats from the economic sector. Specifically, we spoke about agricultural systems that are inherently unsustainable, monocultures and the use of pesticides threatening biodiversity. And the problem being that there are incentives for these types of production. We also spoke about the lack of recognition of the value of environment, of its goods, its services, and the inherent value of the environment. Next, we spoke about some key legal issues here. The lack of dialogue between disciplines and agencies, lack of expertise. So, for example, you don't have green tribunals in all countries. And we also spoke specifically about how companies often, not people, are identified when you have cases of environmental crimes. And so you have this problem of corporate shields and a lack of deterrence. And then we spoke a little bit about the legal mechanisms. So a desire to move away from relying only on top-down command and control approaches, and where there is enforcement for crimes, that there be more effective punishment, although not only relying on this is important. We also spoke about integrating other legal systems and other legal tools to elevate the issue of environment. So, for example, you might speak of environmental issues in a human rights tribunal to protect the environment and not just people. And also there was a suggestion that we make environmental law knowledge mandatory within various legal institutions, educational institutions. So, thank you. Does anybody from our group have anything to add?
Well, I would open it up for additional questions on any of those reports. Is there anything that anyone would like to say or add to those, or principles they found interesting in those documents, or something they might have wanted to add? Well, I don't want to give the last word. We'll go ahead and start kind of moving towards the closing. We've invited Ben Boer to come back at the conclusion of our meeting to talk a little bit about the World Declaration on Environmental Rule of Law, which he and several others have been working on developing in preparation for this Congress. And at any rate, our hope is that we can take some of these lessons learned and principles and points that you all have made, and especially through your presentations in the morning and through these sort of group discussions, to be able to feed in some principles that will be important from the perspective of the young generation, and as far as defining what environmental law should be and what the environmental rule of law should mean for us and for future generations as we enter a new era. So I don't know that I have that much more to add to that, but all right. Great, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
So I'm not sure when Ben will be here, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the process he's going to be addressing us about, and that's about the World Declaration on Environmental Rule of Law, and importantly, where the work we've done today, how that feeds into that process. So the wider Congress is working through developing a set of principles for the environmental rule of law. And what we will do, as Nick has alluded to, is work through bringing together the principles we've come up today and see what and how we could have some of the things we've come up with today, have that feed into the rest of the process. and also to indicate that there's an early career session at the Congress, and we'll be presenting a synthesis of the discussion here today. We also will probably be in touch to get people to the presentation.
That will be on Friday as one of the plenary sessions toward the conclusion of the main congress. We'll look forward to having all of you there. We got a message then. Well, we'll take a few-minute break until Ben arrives, but before we do that, antes de encerrar, eu quero agradecer a todos que apoiaram a realização desse evento aqui no Ministério Público, principalmente os que estão ajudando na informática também, que realmente fizeram um trabalho muito bem feito, eu agradeço. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped with this, and especially those who have helped with the filming and projection and all of the IT needs that we had throughout the day. It's been great to be with you all. So thanks very much to everyone at the Ministério Público, and especially Andrea, who was helping, even holding the signs. Yeah, and also special thanks to Eduardo and Marconi and Danilo, who were those who escorted everyone this morning to the hotels, and have been very helpful in helping us organize all of this. And thank you ultimately to all of you who submitted such great work. And we're really pleased to be able to include that and meet with all of you today. So we'll take a break for just a few minutes until, break for 10 minutes until 1 minute.